Well, the title says Easter basket. And for the life of me, I can't remember why I thought that was going to be a good title. It's not a good title. It's kind of a dumb title. But I've forgotten why. Except that I wanted to talk about what gift Christ gives us at Easter time, based on this text today. So let us pray. If you were not risen, our faith would be in vain. And we of all people who have put our faith in you would be most to be pitied. We thank you, Lord Christ, that among all the people here whom we do see, you are here, whom we do not see, and yet in whom we believe. Amen. Well, they had locked the doors because they were scared. It's the reason we always lock doors. We're afraid of what might come from the outside. They had locked the doors. Did you know that we lock our doors on Sunday now? We do. We lock the doors of the building. When it's church time, all the doors around are locked. I think we may even lock the front doors. I don't know. On Easter Sunday, Taylor was coming from Wilmington, bringing the children. It had been a hectic morning. She wanted to be here for Easter. She was coming from Wilmington, and wouldn't you know it, she missed exit 355. You know what exit 355 is? It's the exit off of I-40 towards Mount Olive. And you know, when you miss that exit, that's at least 20 more minutes, isn't it? So Taylor just said, okay, that's church gone. I'll just have to wait for him at home. But she can drive pretty fast, and she did. And she got here in the parking lot at 2 minutes after 10. She came to the back door, as she's been taught to do, and the back door was locked. She went to the next door on that side, it was locked. She went to the door on the end of the building, it was locked. And she came all the way around, and finally there was an open door. Don't you know she was in a great mood to come to Easter worship? Locked doors. The disciples were afraid, shaky knees. And into the room comes Jesus. Jesus comes and he gives some really important gifts to them. The first gift he gave them was his presence. The gospel is very clear. When they looked up, it was Jesus. It was not a vision of Jesus. It was not a hope or an idea. It was not some vision spawned by group hysteria. As hard as it is for us to conceive, a dead person had gotten up from the grave and had come in through locked doors. It was Jesus, all right. It's not easy to believe. In fact, there are plenty of Christians who claim Christ, who claim that you don't have to believe it, not in the literal flesh and blood resurrection. I wrote a newsletter article. I'm sure you've already read it. But if you haven't, please read it. I was troubled by something I read on Easter Monday. It was an interview in the New York Times between Nicholas Kristof and Serene Jones. She's the president of Union Theological Seminary, New York, which has nothing at all to do with my alma mater in Richmond, which I'm very glad about. This is a portion of the interview. Kristof says, "Happy Easter, Reverend Jones." This is Easter Eve. To start, do you think of Easter as a literal flesh and blood resurrection? I have problems with that, he says. And she says, when you look at the Gospels, the stories are all over the place. There's no resurrection story in Mark, just an empty tomb. Those who claim to know whether it happened or not are kidding themselves. But that empty tomb symbolizes, that's the key word here, symbolizes the ultimate love in our lives that cannot be crucified and killed. It's not a real thing. It's a symbol of something else. Christoph comes back. But without a physical resurrection, isn't there a risk that we are left with just a crucifixion? And she says, doubling down, crucifixion is not something that God is orchestrating from upstairs. The pervasive idea, which is called, by the way, the doctrine of the atonement, the pervasive idea of an abusive God-Father who sends his own kid to the cross so God can forgive people is nuts. For me, the cross is an enactment of human hatred. But what happens on Easter is the triumph of love in the midst of suffering. Isn't that reason enough for hope? You know, I have a bust of Abraham Lincoln in my office. I happen to believe that Abraham Lincoln was the best president we ever had, given all the circumstances he faced. I saw that bust at a secondhand shop. Sally gave it to me as a birthday present. I've had it in my office ever since. I love that bust. What a face that man has. The suffering, the lines of trouble on that face. I look over there sometimes and I think, thank God there was a president like you when we needed you. But here's the thing. Abraham Lincoln is dead. Abraham Lincoln can't save me. There's only one who can save. The one who died and rose again from the grave. Serene Jones might do well to think of something one of her alumni said years before she served. This is what Frederick Buechner says about the resurrection. It's a little bit of a long quote, but I promise you it's really important. Buechner says, we can say that the story of the resurrection means simply that the teachings of Jesus are immortal, like the plays of Shakespeare or the music of Beethoven. Or we can say that the resurrection means that the spirit of Jesus is undying and that he lives on among us, the way Socrates does, in the good he left behind him, in the lives of all who follow his great example. Or we can say that the language in which the Gospels describe the resurrection is the language of poetry, and that as such is not to be taken literally, but as pointing to a truth more profound than the literal. Remember her word, symbolic. Very often I think that's the way the Bible is written. But in the case of the resurrection, this simply does not apply, because there is no story about the resurrection in the New Testament, except in the most fragmentary way. It is not described at all. There's no poetry about it. Instead, it's proclaimed as a fact. Christ is risen. In fact, the very existence of the New Testament depends on it. Unless something very real took place on that strange, confused morning, there would be no New Testament, no church, no Christianity. Yet we try to reduce it to symbol anyway. We talk about Easter meaning the return of life to the dead earth, or the rebirth of hope to the despairing soul. We try to suggest that these miracles are what the resurrection are all about, but they are not. In their own way, they are all miracles, but they are not this miracle, the central one to which the Christian faith points. Unlike the chief priests and the Pharisees, who tried with soldiers and a great stone to make themselves as secure as they could against the terrible possibility of Christ really rising from the dead, we are considerably more subtle. When we are pressed to say what it was that actually did happen, what some are apt to come out with is something pretty meager. This miracle of truth that never dies. This miracle of a life so beautiful that 2,000 years have left the memory of it undimmed. This miracle of doubt turning into faith, fear into hope. Buechner concludes, if I believe that this or something like this was all that the resurrection meant, then I would turn in my certificate of ordination and take up some other profession. You understand? Without the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ, for the Christian there is no power, no presence, just a thin gruel of human hope. Jesus' disciple John would later write of the resurrected Christ, we write to you of him whom we have heard with our own ears, about him whom we have seen with our own eyes, about the one we have touched with our own hands. We write to you so that the joy that we have you may share, that our joy may be complete. It's the joy of Jesus' presence, the Jesus who's very much alive. That's one gift. And then there is the gift of his peace. Jesus comes in, and out of all the things he might have said to the disciples, well, thanks a lot, guys. You were faithful to the end, all right. Or way to go, Peter. You said you'd never deny me. Out of all the things Jesus might have said to them, what he said was so unexpected and so undeserved. Shalom Aleichem, Jesus said. Shalom Aleichem. He said it twice so they wouldn't miss it. Peace be unto you. In the 6th grade, we had a teacher named Mrs. Eller. You know what 6th graders are like. The boys in the back of the classroom nicknamed her Mrs. Smeller. That's what we called her, tittering under our breath, Mrs. Smeller. One day we wrote a note about Mrs. Smeller, and we're passing it around in the back of the room. Miss Smeller had good eyes. She saw the note, and she summoned it to the front of the room. You know how your heart goes in your throat. She took the note, she read it silently, and she folded it, her face red. And she said, all right, you boys, you, and you come here after school, right here. So, you know what a long day that was? It was a really long day. All day long we thought about, oh man, we're in trouble. What are we going to do? She's going to tell our parents, oh, it's going to be terrible, terrible, terrible. We sat down, the day was over. There was Mrs. Eller, and for the longest time she just didn't say anything. She looked at us. That made it worse. And finally, when she opened her mouth, out of all the things she might have said, what she said was, you know what? I've enjoyed teaching you boys. You're good boys. Most of the time, anyway. She said, I've enjoyed teaching you. And then she stopped. She said, I have a note here. Any of you want this note? Oh, no, ma'am. No, ma'am. All right, boys. Go on. I'll see you tomorrow. Now, you know what she said? Shalom Aleichem. Peace be unto you. You see what a miracle Jesus' peace is? We don't deserve it, but oh, he gives it. And then there's the gift of his wounds. Jesus showed Thomas his wounds. He said, stop your doubting and believe. Wounds are powerful, you know. Wounds speak more powerfully than words. Poet Edward Shillito speaks of the wounds in his poem, Jesus of the Scars. The other gods were strong, he writes, but thou wast weak. They rode, but thou didst stumble to a throne. But to our wounds only God's wounds can speak. And not a God has wounds, but thou alone. Life as he knew it ended for Chad Brumpton on Mother's Day. of 2005 by the Euphrates River in Iraq. At the time, Chad was a tank commander in Company C, the 4th Tank Battalion of the United States Marines, 4th Division. His M1 Abrams was a quintessential tank. In fact, it had been through IED blasts that barely dusted the paint off. But on that day, they ran over a very large IED that was directly under the tank. It penetrated the tank, burst into it. It thrust Chad's head into the hatch and tore his legs apart. Sergeant Luke Miller and Chad's driver, Lance Corporal Fernando Lizade, pulled him from the wreckage while under enemy fire. Miller, who would later receive a Bronze Star with Valor for his courageous actions, went back to the tank, still under fire, to save the team's gunner, who was also injured. All 4 men survived. Eventually, Chad returned to Idaho, his native home, to recover. He would later name his son Luke in honor of the one who saved him. He said, "My goal when I went back was to recover fully the life I had lost." Desperate to get back to normal life, he deliberately shortened an 18-month recovery period to 7 months. He got a job working as a parole officer. He started back to work, but he says it was not a good quality life. His left foot, from nerve damage, never worked. In his right, there was constant bone-on-bone contact. The only way he could get out of bed in the morning was to take a heavy dose of narcotics. It left him in a fog, and finally, 3 years later, he came to the decision. He had both of his legs amputated beneath the knee. It would eventually allow him to live with less pain and without the prescription drugs that clouded his mind. It seemed for a while that his life was effectively over. But instead of mourning, he began to celebrate. "I was ready to get off pain medication," he said, "to do the things I used to do. 12 weeks after surgery, I put on my first set of legs. It was euphoria going from the wheelchair to standing again." He went on to tackle snowboarding. He had a set of running blades made for his legs. All I wanted to do was to be active again. He decided it was time for a professional change. He quit his job as a probation officer. He took up a career with prosthetics. He was a tinkerer, and he thought, who better to tinker and build prosthetics for people who are amputees than one who is one himself? And so that's what Chad is doing with his life now. You know how powerful wounds are? If you had lost your leg, wouldn't it help you to look across the table and see that the one who had made you a prosthetic device is someone who understands what it is to lose a leg? So are the wounds of Christ. Christ's wounds speak to us. They say, "I understand what it is to suffer because I have suffered." Those wounds also speak to God the Father. They say, "See how much I love them, that I would give my life to them." And the last thing that Christ gives us as an Easter gift is the gift of a mission. Jesus breathed onto his disciples the gift of the Holy Spirit. And he said, "Now go, forgive." The one who cried out from his very cross, "Father, forgive them," now says, "You go and be my forgiving presence in the world." 10 years ago, the Barna Research Group interviewed 16 to 29-year-olds about the Christian faith and the church. A startlingly large group of them, 87%, used the term judgmental to describe the Christian church. 87%. How did that happen? Jesus says our main mission in the world is to go and offer forgiveness. How do we become thought of as judgmental? 2 years ago, A-plus filmmakers set up a large blackboard against the chain-link fence surrounding the Joseph Petrosino Park in Brooklyn. At the top of the blackboard was a single caption, "My biggest regret." They put the blackboard there and waited. Passers-by came and stopped and read the caption, and one by one they began to write on the blackboard. Some wrote long stories of regret. In the video, some of the writers are interviewed. One woman talks about, movingly, the dreams she did not follow, the things she did not do, the wrong things she had done. And she said, "Oh, I wish it could be different." And then the producers of the video hand those who entered their interview an eraser. And one by one, they go up and erase life's biggest regret. At the end of the video, one woman writes upon the blackboard these words: "Clean slate. Every day is a clean slate." It may have been a movie, but I tell you what I think it was. It was church. It was the way church should be. This is a gift from Jesus, along with his presence, with his peace, the gift of wounds. Happy Easter, everybody. In the name of the Father, and the Son,